Welcome to Bird Burger, where we talk about all things wildlife and nature oriented. Wildlife photography has come a long way since older days in which we took literal film, processed it in a dark room, and shared it for the public to see. Nowadays, we take our images, edit them, manipulate them like crazy, and share them with the rest of the world. So today we're going to be talking about why it's important to edit well, how to edit well, and also, if it's even okay to do so in the first place. So today I'm joined by awesome wildlife photographer Rick Evans, who's the creator, kind of founder of the wildlife channel Remain Wild. And really awesome guy. How are you doing, man? Thanks for being on here.
Dude, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the show. This is going to be a lot of fun. I've been looking forward to this, and I've loved all the conversations that you've had with some of the other photographers that I've watched. So this should be pretty cool.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. Yeah, I have to say, out of maybe anyone I've filmed with, I'm probably the most jealous of your YouTube studio setup. So
yeah, it's a little over the top, I know, but. People like it.
It's awesome.
All the colorful lights, and it's just a vibe, dude. It's fun.
So yeah, first let's talk about some of the technicalities of editing at a base kind of fundamental level. I think of two things that a camera will fail to capture perfectly. Like it can get pretty close, but it'll never quite capture it perfectly according to what you're actually seeing out in the field. And if you just leave your camera in all automatic settings, it won't quite capture this correctly. And so editing is so important for a thing like that. So to discuss, I guess, kind of the first topic that comes to mind when I think about this is, can you talk about how a camera attempts to capture white balance and what you can kind of do to fix this in editing?
Yeah, so essentially the way that your camera reads white balance is it will look at the scene and it sort of detects the brightest areas of the image, and it decides that that's sort of the white point, and it will try to correct that for color balance. On the Kelvin scale of white balance, you have closer to like 3200, which is that tungsten orange amber kind of color, and then more towards like 5600, 6000. That's like the daylight sort of area, which is a little bit more whiter and blue. So it'll try to make it as white as possible. If you know that you want a certain look, like let's say you're shooting at sunset and you want it to be that kind of rich orange ambery look, you might want to dial in your white balance manually, fire off a shot, and just make sure it's giving you that warm tone that you want.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I mean, you can always bring a white card into the field with you, like an old school, like videographer.
Yeah.
I don't usually like bring this in the field with me, but these are good.
You got one, yeah.
For shooting video, like I always white balance off one of these. And it can give you like, it tells the camera, this is white. Then you can set your Kelvin, your white balance there manually if you want to.
That's good. Yeah. Cause our eyes, a lot of people don't understand that our eyes like pretty naturally adjust and interpret colors according to what, white looks like in each scenario, but a camera can't naturally do that. It'll try to, and sometimes it can be pretty decent, but sometimes it can be way far off, so like, that's why like sometimes when you're shooting, in those very cold scenarios, like in the morning, completely in the shade, everything is just so blue or, or vice versa. So that's some really good stuff. And yeah, it's so important to be able to, like you said, kind of just manipulate that through temperature and tint in your editing and get a solid white balance look, because a good color accuracy is just so important. If you're going for a natural look in an image, just so important to really selling that. So that's some good stuff. The other thing that I kind of think about is not only white balance, that's so important to correct in every image on, that base fundamental level, but also exposure. Not only what kind of like level of exposure it's going to shoot it at in the sense of what f-stop number is it going to use, what shutter speed is it going to use, what ISO, but I also think a lot about why it's so important to shoot in RAW. That way you can get the most dynamic range out of your image and stuff like that. Can you share a little bit maybe about why that's kind of important to know how to adjust those different exposure levels and even maybe shoot in manual or whatever it may be? That way you can kind of make sure you get a good exposure in your images.
Absolutely. So like you said, shooting in RAW is so important if you really want to take this seriously, because it captures not only all that color information from like your white balance that we were just talking about, but it captures so much more of that dynamic range in your photo, and you'll be able to retain a lot more in the shadow areas and the bright areas that you can bring back in post. It's important not to clip your image in, you know, in one way or the other. You don't want to blow things out, and you don't want to crush the blacks too much. If you're not sure, it's better to err, I think, on the side of being a little underexposed than overexposed. It's a lot easier to recover detail in the shadows and bring some of that back up than recover something that's blown out. Because honestly, if you blow something out, it's gone. Like it's not coming back. And I've tried.
It better have been a choice,
it doesn't matter how far you bring down that exposure. It's just like this white splotch on your photo, and it's like that's not coming back.
It's not pretty.
So basically, the way that your camera determines exposure, and this is probably one of the things that I think beginning photographers struggle with the most, is nailing exposure. And the way that I learned to do it that made the most sense for me was your camera tries to automatically make everything, expose everything for 18% gray, which is sort of a neutral tone. Again, going back to this card that I have here, this was white, but this color here is 18% gray. So that tone there is what your camera is trying to expose for. That's what it's been calibrated to do. So if you're trying to just expose for a regular scene, like, so for instance, when I go out in the field and I'm going to shoot some wildlife, right when I get out of the car and let's say I'm hitting the trail, I look for something that is around that tonality, like the dirt on the trail, or maybe some bark on a tree, or even green grass can sometimes be that tone. It's weird. You kind of have to suck the color out of your like try to remove the color in your imagination and be like, yeah, exactly. Like look at its grayscale in your mind and be like, yeah, that's roughly that. So usually like dirt on the trail is like what I'll usually meter. Now, one important thing is, so if you're shooting, let's say like a snowy egret or a great egret, something just completely white, if you photograph that bird after balancing off of like one of those neutral tone, it's going to try to, basically if you meter the bird and put that needle in the center, your bird's going to look kind of grayish. To make it look white, you actually want to open up a little bit more. So meter the white feathers of the bird and then open up your exposure like maybe a stop to like a stop and a half. Watch that needle on the meter, and you don't want to go quite to the end because then you're going to be blowing things out and losing detail. But maybe like 3/4 of the way towards the end of, towards that plus sign on your meter. And then same thing for dark black subjects like American coots or something like that. Meter the plumage of the bird that's really dark and stop down a little bit. But again, don't go all the way to the end because you'll lose some of the detail in the feathers and things like that. And that's basically so like how I've been manually dialing in the exposure for years now, and it's worked out really well for me. It's a technique. You got to practice it and learn it. But I think when you start to understand exposure that way, it just really helps out, and you're not doing so much work in post. Yeah, no, that's really good. And I like how you shared even like in those two more unique scenarios, like tricks of how like understanding exposure, not just like on the base level of like, how do I get that 18% gray that you were talking about always, but rather like sometimes you actually want to adjust a little bit differently than that 18% gray, and stuff like that. That way in editing, you're able to enhance that, bring that out, that contrast out, that dynamic out in the exposure of that subject or the surroundings and whatever it may be. So that's some really good stuff. I feel like, when I was a kid even, I remember like this stigma of, editing in photography being kind of like this misrepresentation or manipulation of what reality actually is. So like I remember thinking of like anytime a photo is edited, that means it's not true to what was actually seen on set or on scene. But I think that actually couldn't be further from the truth. Like when I take an image and I look at the raw image that I took,
Because a good camera will balance that and flatten that so well. When I look at that, that doesn't look like a very vibrant or realistic like dynamic of what I actually saw in real life. I see it as kind of like this, I guess, more realistic view of what we're seeing when we are able to edit a photo really well and bring out and enhance kind of the reality of what was being seen on that location, like the color and again all those dynamic ranges and stuff. We're moving sort of out of this archaic system of like just capturing whatever it is and kind of just having this like grainy or grayish kind of image into a much more like vibrant and color representative kind of image world. So I guess my question around that is, what's kind of your thoughts around the stigma of maybe this misrepresentation or misunderstanding with editing in wildlife photography, and how do you view it fitting into that idea of like capturing a good representative wildlife image?
I totally get what you mean, how there was a time where it seemed like editing your photo kind of seemed like you were cheating, right? But now, especially with RAW, you have to do some significant editing because RAW photos by nature are flat, and the saturation sort of sucked out of it. So you have to reintroduce the contrast and the colors back into it naturally. Like if you want it to look like an actual natural photo that you saw with your eyes out in the field.
Yeah.
And that's to be expected. And then I think to really make your photo stand out and make it something kind of special, you need to do a little bit more tweaking and manipulation, shaping the light and things like that. And it's just an understood thing. It's something that we're all kind of doing to a degree. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I don't think that we're misrepresenting anything. I mean, some people arguably could. I try not to. I try to make all my photos as natural as possible.
Yeah.
And just bring out whatever was going on in the scene. I just try to make sure that that's conveyed to the viewer as best as possible,
I think it's really interesting. You talk about like this idea of you're trying to convey it in the most natural way possible. And so I think that it's interesting thinking about what is the line of that? Like, what is the line of, okay, this is like a natural representation of this bird in this habitat or this animal subject in this habitat versus this is a very heavily manipulated photoshopped image and stuff like that. So I guess the question around that would be maybe not to the extent of Photoshop yet, so we can save that maybe for the next question, but in terms of maybe lighter photo manipulation, things like maybe adjusting certain colors on your HSL scales to, appear slightly like different tints or different temperatures of those colors, or maybe things like light masking, in terms of like maybe darkening the exposure around the subject or other things like that. What's your kind of thoughts on that in terms of, do you feel like that still falls under the category of kind of like natural representation, or do you feel like that kind of crosses a border and a line into maybe this, okay, now we're being more like an artist with a paintbrush and kind of like just throwing random colors on here and stuff like that? What's kind of your thought on that?
I think there probably is a line to be crossed, but I think when it comes to like adding vignettes or using masking tools to sort of darken the edges and sort of like in the old photo days, we called that sort of dodging and burning, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you ever did any actual like film development back in the day, but that's kind of like the techniques that we used to use. I think I do it on my photos, and I don't shift colors all that often. I have done it a couple times, like, for instance, if I shoot like a little bird and most of the leaves on the tree are sort of in that fall transitional phase and they're kind of yellow, but there's still some green in there. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I'll just swing that green all the way down to yellow just to make it less distracting and just make it,
more simple.
Exactly. It's not really to like be like, oh, I shot this in the middle of the fall. Like I'm trying to make it look like fall when it wasn't or anything like that. Again, I'm not misrepresenting anything. I just if something's distracting, I'll try to manipulate the photo so it's not. Like I'll look at a photo and I'll go, is my eye being drawn away from the subject by anything in here? And if it is, I'll see what I can do about that, because your eyes are naturally drawn towards the brightest areas of an image. So in order for the viewer you want the viewer's eyes to go directly to the subject. And we achieve that first by composition, right? But then the second part of that is making sure that the focal point is the bird or the beaver, the alligator, whatever you're shooting, by shaping that light in post. And we use masking tools to do that typically. And that's, I think that's everyone's kind of doing that to a degree, and some people do it heavily, and it's still okay, because again, photography is subjective. I don't want it to sound like any of this is wrong. I mean, you do what you want with your photos. If you want to,
it is opinion really at the end.
Creative image, and that's fine. Just again, don't misrepresent it and be like, oh, I shot this wren in this blue tree, and it's like, what? Blue trees. But,
we got blue trees around here.
Yeah. I mean, make your trees blue if you want. Just don't tell me that you saw a blue tree. That's exactly.
Yeah, that's really good. This upcoming Monday, we're releasing actually a Reacts video together. So the other kind of portion of this channel being podcasts and Reacts, we're going to be doing a fun video together that we're releasing. So make sure to look out for that and check it out when it comes. But in that video, we'll look through, we look through some different photoshopped images as well that are much more heavily manipulated. And I like what you were saying about, like, at the end of the day, it's your art. It's your photography. You should do what you want with it. And I'm definitely on page with that. And I would hope that most people would be able to be willing or accepting of that. I think it's interesting just to think about then in regards to like a standard for wildlife photography. When do we consider someone a good wildlife photographer versus just like a good, photo editor who can just master manipulate things to make them look phenomenal. So it's an interesting like dynamic of like what is more of like, okay, I'm a wildlife photographer and I edit my images to help that versus okay, I'm just a really good Photoshop artist and I can take anything and make it just look amazing, right? So we're going to look at some images, that have stuff to do with that. Do you think there's differences when we talk about Photoshop and photo manipulation? Do you think there's differences between kind of, natural representation of kind of like the removing of subjects or I shouldn't say subjects, but like items, objects in your images versus the idea of kind of adding objects? Like, right, you can go into Photoshop and let's say there's a unpleasant sign in the background that you didn't want in your image. You could just remove that, subject mask it and crop it out and delete it. And then I forget what it is, content aware fill it or, things like that, which is just removing an unpleasant tiny aspect of an image versus you can do things like more additive, like let's say adding stars in the background of like, maybe an owl image that you took or something like that. Or I guess what's kind of your thought on removing and adding different aspects of an image in terms of natural representation? I
certainly have removed things from my photos, again, if they're distracting. Like trash, unfortunately there's a lot of trash that'll end up in shots, and it's like, it's in the marsh, and I'm like, well, I'm not going out there to get it, so it's just in my frame, and I'll get rid of it later. I've certainly done that, and I think that's fine, that's acceptable. Removing some sign in the background or maybe telephone poles, something like that. I don't see any problem with that. Also, removing natural elements, like people who photograph songbirds, which I do occasionally. It's so difficult because they're so small and so fast. Removing little twigs from that frame is pretty common practice. Because they're always in like heavy brush or like on a branch, and there's a bunch of like little twigs like hanging in the frame, and they're just very distracting. I think it's very common practice to remove those, and that's fine. Yeah. As far as adding things go, I don't think I've ever added anything to a photo, but I know that sky replacement became a thing kind of recently, where Photoshop sort of added this tool that it will automatically detect your sky and replace it with, they literally have like a library of different skies that you can just drop in there. Again, it's all subjective. If you want to add skies to your photos, if you want two suns in your photos, that's cool, but just like don't misrepresent it and say that,
Yeah.
this I shot this eagle on a stormy, dramatic day. It was like, well, nah, you didn't. But it's fine. It's like, that's sort of what I would say is, if you want to add things, go for it. But I personally, I try to keep things as natural and representative of the scene as possible, because I try to convey where these animals live as much as possible. I like photographing and incorporating the habitat.
Yeah, I really like what you shared about that, because I think it's interesting thinking about like the purpose of a wildlife photography image, because sometimes we think of like the purpose, sometimes I guess the temptation might be to think just like, how can I take the coolest image? But I think that I really like what you were bringing up about kind of like trying to capture the scenery and everything else with the subject, because I think really the purpose of the image at the end of the day is to tell like this really deep story and connect this really deep emotion of like, this is what it's like to witness or be with this animal out in nature, versus just like, how can I make the coolest looking shot, right? Like I can Photoshop an eagle, like we were talking about, a bald eagle flying through fire, but that doesn't give me any sort of emotional connection to like I guess the realness of like how that would feel like in nature, versus like, capturing an eagle with maybe like a lens flare from the sun in the background, like, approaching a perch could be so much more powerful, at least in my opinion. So it's kind of interesting to think about that and that concept. We've been talking about the kind of the conceptual idea of, I guess, what is the line in terms of wildlife photography, editing and stuff like that. But going back again, kind of to the two things we previously mentioned about white balance and exposure being a problem that editing is so useful to correct, in wildlife photography. I'd be curious to know, what other, I guess, kind of techniques do you use regularly to help just enhance your photos in this very kind of, base fundamental type of way?
So I regularly use the graduated masking filter in Lightroom to sort of, usually like the sky's kind of bright, so I'll kind of, make it a little bit darker from the top down. Kind of like, that's something that I commonly use, or from the sides or something like that. The radial filter. Sometimes like the vignette is like, if you use the vignette tool, which I do sometimes, which kind of, darkens the corners and sort of, focuses things more towards the center. Yeah. But I'll sometimes use that radial filter to make a little bit more of a narrow selection around my subject sometimes. But I try to keep it subtle. And that's one of the things that like I usually stress in my editing tutorials on my channel is when you're making these adjustments, you don't want the viewer to like see the adjustments. You know what I mean? Again, you want the focus to be on the bird, on the animal.
That's good advice.
So just keep it subtle and make sure everything's nice and feathered in, and it's not distracting. You're not like looking at it and going, wow, that's like a heavy vignette on that photo.
Yeah.
But so those are some of the things that I commonly use to sort of, I guess, manipulate things in that way.
That's some really good stuff that you're saying, especially like you shouldn't, like the idea, the goal is actually to allow the viewer to not have to realize that this photo was, edited in whatever type of way. Like if your edit has been recognized, that means that like by, an average common person who's not trying to dig for it, I guess. But if your edit is just very quickly and easily being like recognized of like, oh, that sky is really purple or, anything like that, then that means you probably didn't actually do the greatest job of editing it. So I really like that, kind of how you were talking about that. Like it should actually be kind of unnoticeable that you made these adjustments, and it should be very smooth and very natural feeling, I think, for a better image. So that's some really good stuff. It makes me think about, you had this one editing tutorial on your channel that I really liked, showing, I can't remember if it was a northern harrier or a white-tailed kite or what it was, but flying through, kind of like flying over a marshland almost, or maybe a grasslands, and you have that sunbeam, and it's a very like kind of landscape mixed with bird photography shot. But it was really creative the way in which you edited it, using that masking to kind of create, like enhance, I should say, this kind of sunbeam that's kind of shining down on this bird. And I really liked it. Can you tell us a little bit more about some other maybe more manipulative or advanced techniques that you use in your wildlife photography to achieve, really very, very natural still looking edits, but very powerful looking edits like that?
Yeah, so that photo in particular, it was a northern harrier, and she was sort of gliding over a marsh and hunting for prey. And it was a cloudy day, and there were sort of like these sun rays that would poke through every now and then. And I was watching her fly around. You know how they do? They just kind of go back and forth over areas.
Yeah.
And I was like, if I sit here and wait, she's going to fly right in front of this one sun ray that was poking down like just for like a few seconds. And I was like, I want to get that. So I sat there and waited, and she was flying through it, and I just snapped off a few frames. And when I brought that back in to edit, I thought, again, in the raw, it's a little flat. And I was like, well, I want to make sure that I demonstrate this sun ray, right, that she's flying through, and I want to make sure people see it, because that was such like the cool part of the photo.
Yeah.
So what I would do is kind of darken the areas around it, and then I think I used two different things there. I basically it was two radial filters, and I used one that was to darken everything around it. Mm-hmm. And then I used another one that was like inverted, where I was manipulating what's inside the ellipsis there, and brought up the whites a little bit, I think is what I ended up doing there. And that just made it apparent that she was flying through the sun ray. Again, I didn't add a sun ray. It was there. I just enhanced it and brought it out a little bit more, teased it out of the elements a little bit more, so you could see it, and it was just part of the photo.
Yeah, that is so cool, and such a good example of like, I love that you're sharing that, because that's such a good example of talking about like kind of the whole thing that kind of started this conversation. And at the beginning of this conversation was kind of like, okay, wildlife photography editing, yes, maybe it can go over manipulative to the point of where it's no longer really about the wildlife photo, but it's more about, your Photoshop skills and stuff like that. But in a lot of situations, there's those times where you're like, you get this beautiful sunbeam like showing off this bird like you're talking about, but it just doesn't quite look the same as what it looked like and felt like in real life. So how can you use editing to just enhance that, represent that, and just bring out the best of it? And I love that. I think that's super cool. And I love that image. That was such a good image.
Thanks.
Personally, I think it'd be really cool just to transition into this last thing of like, I know that I love getting to hear from people's stories of kind of like how they've learned, the process they've gone through, and all that stuff. And I think especially for people who are maybe more in the beginning stages of their wildlife photography, listening to stuff like that can be just incredibly valuable. In closing, can you tell us a little bit about how you learned to edit your wildlife photos and kind of the whole journey of that from beginning to where you are now?
So, in general, when I got started editing the photos, I didn't know what I was doing, and I just would move faders, and I'm like, that looks cool, right? And then like I look at those photos now, and I'm like, oh god,
yeah.
But I learned a lot from watching other YouTubers that weren't necessarily wildlife photographers. Like I'm sure most people are familiar with Peter McKinnon and Matty Hopoya and those kind of guys, and they regularly would edit photos on their YouTube channels, and I learned a lot just what the tools do. So that was just got me familiar with the interface and how to use the tools to manipulate certain things. But as far as like wildlife specific editing, once you get comfortable using Lightroom and the editing tools and the interface, and you're comfortable knowing what everything does, I think just looking at other photographers' work is sort of a way to learn, because you can just look at something and go, okay, as a photographer, you can look at it and just go, okay, I think it looks like they probably did something like this, and I can, try a different color shift here. Like I usually try to keep my photos as natural as possible, but I've seen some where people will kind of shift the color balance a little bit, where it still looks natural, but it's like it really gives off a vibe. And I've been trying that a little bit more with my photos, and I'm like, oh wow, that really is dramatic, and that's cool. and other things like incorporating man-made lights and things like to get bokeh. Have you?
Yeah.
I don't know if you follow any photographers that just
Yeah.
have these like amazing bokeh balls like all over.
Yeah.
And I was like, whoa, that's really cool.
Some cool
I would have
techniques, yeah.
avoided that like in the field usually. Like I don't want these distracting lights, but they end up looking really cool.
Yeah.
And that's something that, I just by looking at other photographers and following them on Instagram or wherever you're, following photographers can really help you learn different techniques and different styles. And it's like, oh, let me go try that, and see what I get. And, you could be really pleased with the results.
It's so important. Like, yeah, just to tack onto that, it's so important. Like, I think I try to get the students that I have in my mentorship programs, like I try to get them comfortable all the time with like editing and adjusting those sliders that they have no idea what they're doing, because just like what you said, like it's so I guess unhealthy for your skill level to just slap filters on things and kind of just like make it look good really quick and not really know what's happening, because you never learn to like understand the fundamentals of how do you create an image to look this way, right? And what you're saying, where it's like when you're able to get to this point where you have this like knowledge and understanding of what your all your different sliders do, all your different masks do, and all these other things, then you're able to kind of like play with it like an artist, like, with the canvas, and they're like slapping different colors of paint on it, and you understand what each color is doing as you're slapping it on, just in the same way that you understand what each slider is doing. And when you're then looking at other people's images, you're able to be like, wow, I really like that. Now I because I understand my editing program, I know how to create an image like that. Now it's just a matter of doing it, which may be a whole nother difficulty level. But at least you're able to, right? And you're able to pursue that. And I love you just sharing that. And yeah, I think that's just super, super valuable. So appreciate you sharing that. And it's very clear when I watch your stuff that you definitely have a good knowledge and understanding of editing and how to edit well. So you do a great job,
thanks.
dude.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that.
Is there any really cool projects you're working on right now? Anything you want to give a shout out to?
Nothing really specific. Hopefully this is that time of year where the elephant seals are sort of in their breeding season up on the central coast of California. Yeah. And I usually try to take a trip up there this time of year to photograph all the pups and the big males fighting. It's one of the most like just incredible experiences to watch. Wow. So I'm going to try to get up there to do that probably in the next week or so and hopefully make a YouTube video around it. And then, I mean, spring is right around the corner. We're going to have, all the migrations happening and that's always exciting, get the warblers flying back through and all the waterfowl will leave me and they'll go back north. Yep. But yeah, it's, I've hopefully got some fun stuff coming up soon. I don't know. I'll have to check out my schedule, but if it worked out, that'd be really awesome. I could meet you down there and we could do something together. So we'll see. Make sure you go subscribe to both of our channels. That way you can see if we actually wind up doing this. But that would be fun, dude. Yeah. Yeah. We live relatively close to each other, probably about like 4 hours away, I'd say. Yeah. So we'll see. Someday we're gonna get together. So regardless, go subscribe to both of our channels. Make sure that we're both doing well. But yeah. Appreciate all the value you added to the conversation, and hopefully it was really helpful to anyone who's watching and wanted to learn a little bit more about editing or just contemplating that idea of editing in their mind. So yeah, absolutely, man. It's been fun. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you go subscribe to the Remain Wild YouTube channel. He's got some really great content on there, a lot you can learn from, and I hope you guys get a lot out of it just as I have. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.